I never imagined the moment that would break me would happen at my own dinner table. One sentence, one command, spoken loudly, deliberately, in front of others who chose to look away. In that instant, I realized I had slowly vanished inside the very home I built, the home I opened out of love. The shock was not just the words themselves, but the certainty behind them, the belief that I no longer had a place where I stood. That night did not end a dinner. It ended an illusion, and it forced me to choose who I would be from that moment on. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different places and cultures. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll never miss our latest stories. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Evelyn Margaret Brooks, and I am 64 years old. I have lived long enough to know the difference between loneliness and solitude, between weakness and quiet strength. When this story began, I was not a woman in crisis. I was not lost, confused, or dependent. I was a widow, yes, but I was also stable, self-sufficient, and deeply rooted in a life I had built with care. That matters, because what happened later was not the result of fragility. It was the result of trust. I live in a red brick house overlooking the Ashley River in Charleston, South Carolina. The house sits on a slight rise, shaded by old oak trees heavy with Spanish moss. It has wide windows, wooden floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and a long porch where I drink my coffee every morning as the river moves slowly past. This house is more than shelter. It is memory. It is proof of a life lived deliberately. My parents lived here before me, and when they passed, the house came to herald in me. We did not rush to modernize it. We repaired what needed fixing and preserved what mattered. We believed some things were worth keeping exactly as they were. Harold, my husband, died 5 years ago from a sudden stroke. One moment he was there, planning to repaint the back railing, and the next he was gone. Grief came in waves, but I learned how to live with it. I learned how to sleep alone in a bed built for two. I learned how to make decisions without turning to someone else for confirmation. I did not crumble. I adjusted. That adjustment shaped the woman I became. By the time this story truly began, my days followed a steady rhythm. I woke early, kept my finances in order, maintained the house myself, and stayed involved in my community. I had a pension from years of careful work and savings I managed responsibly. I was not wealthy, but I was secure. I believed that after a lifetime of responsibility, I had earned a quiet sense of control over my own space. My daughter Laura was my only child. I raised her to be independent, thoughtful, and kind. She grew up in this house, learned to ride her bike on the street out front, and celebrated every birthday in the dining room that still stands untouched. Our relationship was close, built on years of shared routines and unspoken understanding. I trusted her without hesitation. That trust felt natural, automatic, and unquestionable. Looking back now, I can see how much of my identity was tied to being a capable woman who never needed to ask for help. I believed strength meant endurance, and that love meant accommodation. I believed that opening my home was the same as opening my heart, and that family would treat both with care. At the time, those beliefs did not feel naive. They felt earned. The house reflected that confidence. Everything in it had a place and a purpose. The documents were filed. The locks worked. The walls held stories, not secrets. When I stood on the porch in the evenings and watched the light fade across the river, I felt safe. I felt certain. I felt at home in every sense of the word. I did not know then that certainty can be fragile. I did not know that familiarity can be weaponized, or that love without boundaries can slowly erase a person. I did not yet understand that the place I felt most secure would one day demand that I defend it. At the beginning, all I knew was that I was standing firmly in a life I believed was unshakable. If you're still watching and starting to sense where this is heading, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what felt like kindness at the beginning slowly turned into something much darker. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The afternoon Laura called me, the house was quiet in the way it usually was on weekdays. Sunlight lay across the hardwood floors, and the river moved slowly beyond the windows, steady and unbothered. I remember thinking how grateful I was for that stillness. When my phone rang and I saw my daughter's name, I smiled before I even answered. I had no reason not to. Her voice told me everything before the words did. She was exhausted, embarrassed, and frightened all at once. The restaurant she managed had closed after the pandemic, and Nathan's commissions had dried up months earlier. Rent was overdue. Credit cards were maxed out. They had tried to hold on longer than they should have, and now they were out of options. She kept apologizing, as if needing help were a moral failure. I did not ask for details. I did not ask how long it would take or what their plan was. I heard my child in distress, and instinct took over. I told her to come home. I said the house was big enough, that it would only be for a little while, and that family took care of its own. I remember saying it would be just temporary, a word that felt comforting and harmless at the time. I believed it. They arrived 2 days later with a car full of boxes and a teenage boy who had grown taller since I had last seen him. Ethan hugged me awkwardly, already halfway between childhood and something harder. Nathan thanked me more than once, his manners careful and practiced. He spoke about getting back on his feet, about short-term plans and long-term goals, about how much this meant to them. I listened and nodded, letting their urgency fill the empty rooms. The first weeks felt almost good. The house had sound again. There were footsteps in the hallway and dishes in the sink. I cooked more than I had in years, and Ethan sat at the table doing homework while I moved around the kitchen. It felt useful, necessary. I told myself this was what family was supposed to feel like. Nathan made himself helpful in small ways. He fixed a loose hinge, carried groceries, offered to take phone calls when my hands were full. He had an easy confidence that made his presence feel temporary rather than intrusive. When he referred to the house as our place, I noticed the phrasing but let it slide. Words can mean many things, I told myself. Laura was tired all the time. When I asked how she was holding up, she said she was just overwhelmed and needed things to be simple. I did not want to add to her burden, so I kept my questions to myself. I told myself I was being supportive, that this was what patience looked like. Slowly, without any single moment to mark the change, the house began to feel different. Furniture shifted. The television was always on. Conversations happened without me. I started adjusting my routines to avoid being in the way, moving through my own space more carefully than before. It was subtle enough, that I could pretend nothing was wrong. At night, when I lay in bed listening to unfamiliar sounds, I reminded myself that this arrangement had a purpose. They were here to recover, not to stay. The word temporary echoed in my mind like a promise that would eventually fulfill itself. I held on to that promise because questioning it felt unkind. I did not know yet how easily kindness could be mistaken for permission. I did not know how quickly the absence of boundaries could become an invitation. All I knew was that my house was fuller than it had been in years, and something in that fullness was already beginning to crowd me out. If this situation already feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 2, so I know you're still here. The first warning sign was easy to ignore, but the next one made it impossible. Let's move on to chapter 3. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot and landing softly on the rug by the front door. At first, it looked ordinary, the kind of envelope I opened without thinking. I made coffee, let it cool too long, and carried the stack of mail to the kitchen table the way I always did. It was only when I read the return address that something in my chest tightened. The bank had my name, my address, and a subject line that mentioned a home equity inquiry. I read it twice, slowly, then a third time. According to the letter, someone had requested preliminary information about borrowing against the value of my house. It did not say a loan had been approved or even formally requested, only that an inquiry had been made and that additional documents would be required to proceed. I sat very still, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, trying to understand how this could have happened. I had not signed anything. I had not spoken to anyone. I had not authorized any discussion about my property. My first instinct was to doubt myself. I checked my files, pulled out my folder of financial records, and went through them line by line. Everything was in order. No forms were missing, no signatures were unfamiliar. The absence of evidence should have reassured me, but it did not. It only sharpened the question I could not ignore. If it was not me, then who? I waited until Nathan came into the kitchen later that afternoon. I kept my voice even when I asked him about the letter, holding it out so he could read it. He glanced at it briefly and smiled in a way that felt practiced rather than surprised. He said it was nothing serious, just something he had looked into while thinking ahead. He talked about options, about flexibility, about how it was smart to know what resources were available. He spoke confidently, as if the matter were already settled and did not require my involvement. I nodded, because that was what I had been doing for weeks. I told myself that curiosity was not a crime and that planning was not the same as acting. Still, when he handed the letter back to me, I noticed that he did not apologize. He did not ask permission. He assumed understanding, and that assumption stayed with me long after he left the room. That evening, I sat at my computer and searched public business records, something I had done many times before in my career, but never for reasons like this. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. Nathan had registered a limited liability company only weeks earlier, using my home address as the principal place of business. The description listed him as a long-term resident with operational authority. The language was careful, technical, and unsettling. It suggested permanence where there had been none. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was preparation. I spoke to Laura later that night, choosing my words carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. I showed her what I had found and explained why it concerned me. She looked exhausted. Her shoulders slumped, her patience thin. She said I was reading too much into it, that Nathan was under pressure and trying to solve problems. She asked me not to make things harder when they were already struggling. That conversation left me quieter than before. I realized I had crossed an invisible line, from being a helper to being an obstacle. My concerns were no longer shared. They were inconvenient. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes that I could no longer dismiss. Nathan answered calls meant for me. Mail went missing and reappeared opened. Decisions about the house were discussed as though I were only peripherally involved. I began locking my documents away, not out of fear, but out of necessity. The shift was subtle, but it was unmistakable. For the first time, I admitted to myself that something fundamental had changed. What I had offered freely was being claimed without consent. Silence, I understood then, was not keeping the peace. It was creating space for something far more dangerous to take root. If you're watching and realizing how quickly boundaries can disappear, comment number 3 below, because this is the moment where silence starts doing real damage. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After the letter from the bank and the discovery of the business registration, sleep did not come easily. Nights stretched longer, filled with thoughts I could no longer quiet. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering where I had misstepped, how something meant to help had begun to feel like a threat. Still, I told myself that confrontation would only fracture what little balance remained. I was not ready to fight. I wanted clarity, not war. I decided to speak to Laura first, not as a homeowner or a woman protecting her assets, but as her mother. I waited until Nathan was out, until the house felt calm enough to hold an honest conversation. We sat at the kitchen table where she had once done her homework, the same table that had carried years of ordinary life. I chose my words carefully, explaining my concerns without accusation. I talked about paperwork, about boundaries, about how unsettled I felt in my own home. Laura listened with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. Her eyes looked tired, not defensive exactly, but worn down. She said she understood my worries, but everything felt like too much all at once. She asked me to be patient, to give them time. She reminded me how hard the past year had been for them and how much pressure Nathan was under. When I pressed gently, she said I was overthinking and that nothing bad was happening. That was when I realized we were no longer speaking from the same place. I was talking about protection. She was talking about survival. Somewhere between those two needs, my voice had lost its weight. I told her I was willing to help, but not without limits. I suggested a clear timeline, 6 months to get back on their feet and find a place of their own. I framed it as a plan, something that would give everyone direction and dignity. I wanted structure, not resentment. I wanted to prevent future misunderstandings before they hardened into something worse. Nathan joined us midway through the conversation, his presence shifting the air in the room. He listened politely, arms crossed, expression neutral. When he spoke, his tone was smooth, measured, and faintly dismissive. He said families did not put deadlines on one another. He talked about loyalty, about trust, about how we were all in this together. He did not agree to anything, but he did not refuse either. He simply spoke as if the matter were already settled by his interpretation alone. Laura said very little after that. She looked from him to me and then back down at the table. Her silence felt heavier than any argument. In that moment, I understood that choosing peace had begun to mean choosing sides, and she had already made her choice. Over the next weeks, the house continued to shift around me. The living room no longer felt like a place I could relax. Conversations stopped when I entered. Plans were made without my input. I began eating later, spending more time in my bedroom, telling myself it was temporary, that this was still manageable. Each small adjustment felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I was not being pushed out with force. I was being edged out with politeness. One evening, as I stood in the hallway listening to voices that did not include me, I felt something inside me give way. It was not anger. It was recognition. I saw clearly that my attempts to keep the peace were costing me my place, my authority, and my sense of self. I had tried kindness. I had tried patience. I had tried silence. None of it had worked. For the first time, I admitted to myself that preserving harmony at any cost was no longer noble. It was erasing me. And if I did not change course soon, there would be nothing left of me to protect. If you're still here and feeling the tension building, comment number 4 to let me know. What happens next is the moment everything explodes, right in front of everyone. Let's move on to chapter 5. The night of Nathan's birthday arrived, wrapped in the kind of forced normalcy that makes tension harder to name. I cooked because that was what I did when people gathered in my house. I seasoned, stirred, and plated with the muscle memory of years. moving through the kitchen as if familiarity alone could steady me. Guests arrived without warning, their voices filling rooms I no longer felt at ease occupying. I noticed details the way you do when you are already on edge. Shoes left near the door, laughter that did not include me, the way conversations flowed around my presence rather than toward it. The dining room looked different that evening. The table was set tightly, chairs pulled close, plates placed with intention. I realized too late that no place had been clearly made for me. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, but it landed heavy. I hovered for a moment, waiting for someone to notice, to shift a chair, to acknowledge that this was still my table. No one did. The air carried the expectation that I would understand without being told. I took a breath and moved forward anyway. The chair scraped softly against the floor as I pulled it back. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the chatter and drawing every eye toward me. For a brief, suspended second, I believed someone would intervene, that Laura would say something, that the evening would right itself. Instead, the room went still. Nathan stood up so suddenly his chair tipped back. His voice was sharp and unrestrained, meant to be heard by everyone. "Get out!" he shouted. He did not lower his tone or soften the words. He went on, making it clear that the dinner was not about me, that I did not belong at the table. The finality of it settled over the room like a verdict. No one spoke. Laura stared at her hands. Ethan looked down at his plate. The guests avoided my eyes, frozen in a discomfort they did not know how to escape. I felt something inside me fracture, not loudly, but completely. It was not just the humiliation. It was the certainty behind his words, the assumption that he could decide where I belonged, in my own home, at my own table. I did not argue. I did not ask for an explanation. I stood there, aware of every line in my face, every year behind my eyes, and understood that I had been erased in plain sight. This was not confusion or miscommunication. This was dominance, performed openly and without apology. I pushed the chair back into place and straightened. My hands were steady. My heart was not. As I turned away from the table, I could feel the weight of their stares pressing into my back. Someone cleared their throat. A glass clinked against a plate. Life resumed its shallow rhythm behind me, as if what had just happened were a necessary correction rather than an unforgivable trespass. I walked out of the dining room and down the hall, each step measured, deliberate. I heard laughter return in fragments, strained but present. In their minds, I was retreating, embarrassed, put in my place. They believed the moment had passed. In my bedroom, I closed the door and stood in the quiet, listening to the house breathe around me. I thought of the letter from the bank, of the business registration, of every small concession I had made in the name of peace. I saw, with sudden clarity, the cost of that peace. It had required my silence, my space, my authority. It had required me. I did not sit down. I did not cry. I understood then that if I accepted this, there would be nothing left to accept. The line had been crossed, unmistakably and publicly. What happened next would not be about salvaging comfort or preserving appearances. It would be about reclaiming myself. When I opened the door again, it was not to return to the table. It was to begin something entirely different. I closed the bedroom door and stood still, letting the sound of the dinner drift toward me through the walls. Plates clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. The evening was continuing without me, exactly as Nathan had intended. That realization did not make my hands shake. It steadied them. The humiliation had already happened. What mattered now was what I did with it. I looked around the room I had retreated to for months, the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall. It held the pieces of my life I had compressed to make space for others, a dresser, a chair, a lamp. I had moved from the living room without comment. I understood then how gradual the loss had been. I had not been pushed. I had stepped aside again and again, believing that courtesy would be returned in kind. It had not been. I did not sit down. I crossed to the closet and knelt in front of the safe built into the floor, the one Harold and I had installed years ago after a storm damaged the roof and we learned how quickly security could vanish. The combination came back to me easily. Inside were the documents I had organized and reorganized for years, the tangible proof of ownership and intention, the deed, the will, bank statements, insurance policies, everything that established the truth I had allowed to be questioned. I laid the papers out on the bed, aligning the edges the way I always had. The order mattered. It reminded me that I was capable of precision even when emotions threatened to cloud it. I saw the pattern clearly now, not as a personal betrayal, but as a sequence of actions designed to claim what was not freely given. This was not about a bad night or a temper lost. It was about control. I picked up my phone and stepped into the bathroom, closing the door behind me. The light was harsh, unforgiving. I welcomed it. I dialed the number for the Charleston County Financial Oversight Office, the one I had bookmarked months earlier after my first uneasy feeling. When the call connected, I spoke carefully and without embellishment. I reported a suspected attempt to misrepresent residency status and to initiate financial actions against a property without authorization. I gave names, I gave dates, I offered documentation. My voice did not rise. It did not waver. When I ended the call, I did not feel relief. I felt clarity. There was no going back from that moment, and I did not want to. I understood that what I had set in motion would unfold on its own timetable, with consequences that could not be softened by apologies or explanations. That understanding brought an unexpected calm. I gathered the documents and returned them to the safe, locking it with a decisive click. The sound echoed in the small space, final and deliberate. I straightened and took a breath, aware of how steady it felt in my chest. For the first time that evening, I felt present in my own body again. When I opened the bedroom door and stepped back into the hallway, the noise from the dining room grew louder. I walked toward it without haste, not to rejoin the table, but to reclaim my position in the house itself. I did not announce myself. I did not explain. I observed. Nathan's posture, the way he leaned back in his chair, already told me everything I needed to know. He believed the matter was settled. He believed I had accepted my place. He was wrong. I stood there for a moment longer, taking in the familiar lines of the walls, the floorboards worn smooth by years of my footsteps. I understood now that my choice was not between conflict and peace. It was between erasure and self-respect. I had chosen. What followed would not be easy, but it would be honest. The decision had been made quietly, without spectacle. That was fitting. Power, I had learned, does not need to shout. It simply needs to act. If you're still watching and wondering what happens after a line is finally crossed, comment number 6 below. Because the choice has been made, and now the consequences begin. Let's move on to Chapter 7. Morning came quietly, almost deceptively so. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as it always had, resting on familiar surfaces that no longer felt neutral. The house was full, yet strangely hollow. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from a sense of alertness that had replaced it. The decision I had made the night before had settled into me like a fixed point. Everything after it felt inevitable. I moved through my routine without rushing. Coffee brewed. Papers were stacked neatly on the counter. When my phone vibrated, I was not surprised. The email was brief and professional, confirming receipt of my report and requesting additional documentation. There was no judgment in its language, only procedure. I responded with what they asked for, attaching files I had kept carefully organized for years. Each click of the send button felt like another door closing behind me. Nathan noticed the change before he understood it. His confidence faltered in small, telling ways. He took calls outside now, his voice low and tense. He paced instead of lounging. The casual authority he had carried through the house evaporated, replaced by irritation that surfaced without warning. He watched me when he thought I was not looking, as if trying to read something in my posture that would reassure him. It did not. Laura sensed it too, though she did not yet know why. She asked questions that went unanswered, her frustration growing as Nathan deflected and minimized. I could see the strain in her, the dawning awareness that things were more serious than she had been led to believe. I did not rush to fill in the gaps. This was not the moment for explanations or comfort. Truth, I had learned, arrives best when it is allowed to stand on its own. The house became a place of avoidance. We moved around one another carefully, conversations reduced to necessity. I did not retreat this time. I used the living room. I cooked when I wanted to. I claimed space without announcing it. Nathan responded by shrinking, his presence less assured, his movements more guarded. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Power had changed hands without a word being spoken. Despite that, the cost of it all pressed in on me. I thought of my daughter, caught between loyalty and reality. I thought of my grandson, absorbing tension he did not create. There were moments when grief rose unexpectedly, sharp and uninvited. I let it pass through me without resistance. Regret, I knew, would not undo what had already been done. Another email arrived that afternoon, this one outlining next steps, interviews, verification, timelines. The language was impersonal, efficient. It confirmed what I already knew. This was no longer a private family matter. It had entered a system that did not bend for sentiment or history. I forwarded the message to a separate folder and closed my laptop. That evening, I stood at the sink washing a single plate, listening to muted voices down the hall. I felt the weight of what was ending and the shape of what was beginning. The family I had tried to preserve no longer existed in the way I remembered it. Something had fractured too deeply to be repaired with patience alone. Still, I did not feel hollow. I felt grounded. The uncertainty that had plagued me for months had been replaced by clarity, and clarity carries its own kind of strength. I understood that consequences were unfolding, not as punishment, but as correction. The truth had been set in motion, and it would not stop simply because it made people uncomfortable. As night settled over the house, I turned off the lights one by one and went to bed. I slept knowing that whatever followed would be faced with my eyes open. The fallout had begun, and for the first time I was not afraid of it. A few days passed, and with them came a strange quiet. Not peace exactly, but a pause where everything felt suspended, waiting for the next clear movement. I was no longer shocked. The sharp edge of the dinner confrontation had dulled into something steadier, more deliberate. We still lived under the same roof, but the house no longer moved to a shared rhythm. Each of us occupied separate currents, intersecting only when necessary. I scheduled a meeting with a civil attorney in Charleston and arrived with a folder thick enough to speak for me. Deeds, statements, correspondence, timelines. I had learned that preparation was not aggression. It was protection. The attorney listened, asked precise questions, and confirmed what I already suspected. Ownership was clear. Authority was clear. What had been blurred by kindness could be restored by structure. He explained the risks of continued ambiguity and the importance of formal notice. I took notes, not because I doubted him, but because clarity deserved to be recorded. The recommendation was straightforward: issue written notice terminating residency, set a legal timeline, and document every step. There was no requirement to act immediately, no need to escalate beyond what was necessary. That mattered to me. I did not want spectacle. I wanted boundaries that could be enforced without cruelty. After a night of consideration, I agreed. Not because I was angry, but because I was done pretending that vagueness was generosity. I drafted the notice carefully, reading each sentence aloud before printing it. The language was firm and neutral, free of accusation. Dates were clear. Expectations were clear. It was not an argument. It was a line. When I handed it to Laura later that afternoon, I did not raise my voice or soften my posture. I told her what would happen and when. She looked stunned, then tired, then thoughtful in a way I had not seen in months. She did not argue. She asked what it meant. I answered plainly. There were no promises of repair, only facts. After that, I turned to the practical work of reclaiming my life. Passwords were changed, mail forwarding was updated, financial documents were secured. I rearranged rooms to reflect reality rather than habit, removing the quiet accommodations I had made without noticing. The house began to feel legible again, its lines and rules visible where they had once been assumed. At night, doubt still tried to surface. The familiar questions hovered at the edges of sleep. Was I being too hard? Would this cost me my relationship with my daughter? Could this have been handled differently? I let the questions exist without answering them. I had learned that uncertainty does not mean error. It means growth is happening where the comfort used to be. I stood one evening at the threshold of the living room and looked around, noticing how space responds when it is no longer negotiated. Boundaries did not make the house colder. They made it honest. I understood then that kindness without limits is not love. It is surrender. The hardest part was over. What remained would require patience, resolve, and time. But for the first time in a long while, I was not guessing my way forward. I was choosing it. If you've stayed this far and want to see how it all ends, comment number 8, so I know you're ready. The final outcome is not what many people expect, but it's exactly what needed to happen. Now, let's move toward the conclusion of this story. Several months passed, and with them came a quiet I had not known I was missing. The house settled into a rhythm that no longer required adjustment or negotiation. Mornings were predictable again. I moved through my days without the constant calculation of how my presence might be received. Time did not erase what had happened, but it softened the sharpest edges, allowing clarity to replace tension. The legal process concluded without drama. Paperwork was reviewed, records verified, and conclusions drawn. There was no ambiguity left to argue over. The house was mine legally and unequivocally. The attempts to blur that truth collapsed under their own weight. I did not feel victorious when it ended. I felt complete. The matter had been resolved in the only way it could be, through facts rather than. Nathan left on a gray morning with little ceremony. Boxes were loaded quietly. No speeches were made. No apologies offered. Laura stood beside him, her posture different than it had been months earlier. She was no longer defensive or defiant, only tired and sober in her understanding. When they walked out, the door closed with a sound that felt final but not cruel. It was the sound of something concluding as it should. In the weeks that followed, Laura reached out. Our conversations were cautious and brief, shaped by honesty rather than habit. We met once for coffee, neutral ground chosen deliberately. She spoke about what she had ignored and what she had learned. I listened without interrupting. I did not rush to comfort or correct. Forgiveness, I understood, is not an event. It is a process that requires time and consistent change. We did not pretend things could return to what they were. We accepted that they would become something else. Life inside the house continued to open up. I reclaimed rooms that had gone quiet. I rearranged furniture, not to mark territory, but to reflect how I live now. I slept better. I breathed easier. The absence of constant tension revealed how much of myself I had been holding back. There were moments of grief that surprised me, not for what I had lost, but for what I had hoped might have been possible. I allowed those moments their space. Loss does not invalidate necessity. It simply reminds us that growth is rarely painless. Standing one afternoon in the doorway of the living room, I felt the weight of the past months settle into perspective. The end of that chapter had not destroyed my family. It had stripped away illusion. What remained was smaller, quieter, and far more honest. I knew then that not all endings are failures. Some are corrections. Some are the necessary closing of a door so that life can continue without distortion. This was one of those endings, and I was finally ready to let it stand. On quiet mornings now, I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let the house be exactly what it is. No voices competing for space, no tension humming beneath the surface. Just the soft sounds of a home returned to itself. I used to think silence meant absence. I know better now. Silence can mean peace. Looking back, I see how easily love can slip into self-erasure if you are not paying attention. I believed being a good mother meant enduring discomfort, absorbing tension, making myself smaller so others could feel secure. I told myself that sacrifice was proof of devotion. What I did not understand was how quickly sacrifice, when unguarded, becomes expectation, and expectation, left unchecked, becomes entitlement. I do not regret opening my door. I do not regret believing the people I loved would treat my generosity with care. Trust is not foolish. Love is not weakness. The mistake was not kindness. The mistake was confusing kindness with obligation and patience with permission. What I learned is this: boundaries are not walls. They are frameworks that allow relationships to exist without distortion. When boundaries are clear, love can breathe. When they are absent, love suffocates under resentment and fear. Saying no does not mean you love less. It means you understand your own worth. For a long time, I believed age made me less relevant, less entitled to space, less deserving of respect. Society reinforces that belief quietly, especially for women. We are expected to fade gracefully, to give without asking, to endure without complaint. But age did not weaken me. It sharpened me. It gave me perspective, resilience, and the courage to stop negotiating my right to exist fully in my own life. If there is anything I would say to another woman who feels invisible in her own home, it is this: pay attention to how you feel when you walk through your front door. Peace should not feel like something you earn by disappearing. Respect should not require silence. Love should not ask you to abandon yourself. Standing up for yourself may cost you relationships as they once were. It may disappoint people who benefited from your quiet compliance. That loss is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But what you gain in return is something far more sustaining. You gain clarity, you gain dignity, you gain yourself. In the end, I did not lose my family in the way I once feared. I lost illusions. I lost roles that required my erasure. What remained was smaller, truer, and honest enough to grow. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and locked the door behind me as I stepped out into the morning. Not to keep anyone out, but because the house and the life inside it finally belonged to me again. In the end, this story is not about conflict, loss, or even justice. It is about awakening. It is about the quiet moment when endurance turns into awareness, and awareness becomes choice. Life has a way of testing how much of ourselves we are willing to give away in the name of love, duty, or peace. Sometimes the greatest lesson arrives late, after years of silence, when we finally understand that self-respect is not selfish and boundaries are not betrayals. Letting go does not always mean failure. Often, it is the most honest form of growth. When illusions fall away, what remains may be smaller, but it is real, grounded, and strong enough to last. Dignity, once reclaimed, becomes a steady foundation no one else can take from you. And that, more than anything, is where true peace begins. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and follow for more stories like this. Your voice matters.